Do you like it when you're reading a book and there is just a seamless transition from one scene to the next? And then when you go to write your own stories, it's like, how do I transition? How do I move from this one scene that was really great to this other scene that's really great? And how do I do that? So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about transitioning from scene to scene.
You have a story to tell, but you don't know where to start. Let me show you how to free your story. I teach you how to write and how to dig deep in your soul to release your story and make a difference in the world.
Welcome to the Julia Monte channel. If we're just meeting, I am Julia Monte. I am a women's fiction author, and I am here on Fridays to give you some writing tips to help you to write your stories and write your books. So today let's talk about scene transition. The way that I'd like you to think about scenes is that they are little mini stories that we're telling within this larger novel. So they are little stories that are kind of self-contained in a way. Something happens at the very beginning, in the middle, and then we have a closing or an end to that scene, right? So we have these little self-contained stories that then we need to tie together with the next little self-contained story that's coming up. Often these scenes are related, obviously, right? So the way that one scene ends, it's where the next one is going to pick up. And if you create that smooth transition from one scene to the next, that's where it creates a really great reader experience. And of course, a number of scenes will create your chapters. The first thing that we should talk about is change, because change must happen within this scene. So let's think about our character. Our character is involved in their daily life. Something happens, right, that sets them on this journey that they're going to go on. Usually the thing that occurs is not a good thing, and that's why the character reacts to this event. And what they do is they attempt to make it right, right? So something happened, it was something unexpected, it was something that set their life off course, and now they're going to try to correct that. They're going to try to make it the way it was before. And of course, they're going to encounter various challenges and obstacles along the way, so that's not going to let them actually fix this problem very quickly. And as they embark on this journey, of course, things are going to change in that character's life. They're going to find new people that they're going to meet. There's all kinds of things that are going to happen. And all this stuff happens within these scenes, right? So in these scenes is where all the change is happening, where all the reaction is happening, where all the obstacles are happening, all the new people are coming in and out of their life. And once the change is done, it's over, that's when your scene is going to end. So it doesn't have to be major, but each scene is going to have this same structure where something happened, the character is reacting to what happened, they're trying to fix what happened, and then that scene is going to conclude with something either positive or negative. The big thing to remember is that you want change, though. Something has to happen. Otherwise, if nothing is happening in that scene, nothing is changing, then it becomes sort of a boring scene that the reader loses interest in. So think of like what new romantic encounters can happen. Think of moving to locations, right? From one location to the next to solve a crime, to do something, but the character needs to move from wherever he's at to somewhere else. There could be battles, there could be all kinds of things that are happening, but there has to be some kind of action, some kind of movement that is happening, so that the character is, again, trying to solve that problem, and as he's solving this problem, all these other things are happening. And then don't forget the emotional changes too. So it's not just the physical changes, but the emotional changes that is occurring as the character is involved in all these situations. There are emotional changes that are happening to that character. So the first thing that we want to be aware of is that change. The second thing is cause and effect. So anytime that something happens, there's going to be an effect that happens as a result of that. So let's say that we go out with friends and we drink a little too much. Okay, so that is the cause. Then we're going to face the consequences the next morning, right? And they could be a number of consequences, and that's the effect, right? So the one consequence could be just that we don't feel good. The next morning we get up, we're not feeling good, we have sort of a headache, upset stomach. It's just the consequence or the effect of that cause of drinking too much. Another effect could be that you get stopped by a police officer that night. You never make it home. Your car gets confiscated. You get arrested for a DUI. Your life turns upside down, right? Because of this one cause, that one cause of drinking too much, having too much fun at the party. So those effects are obviously deeper than the first of just not feeling well, being tired the next day. So there are different consequences for the same effect. It's not always the same consequence. It just depends on how you write it and what you want the effect to be. So in the first scenario, you might just perform poorly at work. You're just not feeling well, you're kind of sick, you have a headache, right? That might be the additional consequence of not of drinking too much. The second one, though, is going to involve going to court. It's going to involve what else? Losing your vehicle, maybe, which could lead to losing your job, right? So the second one has deeper consequences, but they're both cause and effect. So in novels, you have to show that cause and effect for every decision that your character makes, and the cause and effect has to be based on your character's decision. So whatever your character's choices, what the choices that they're making are going to lead to a certain effect. And I will post below a couple of blogs that I wrote about cause and effects so that you can read a little bit more about it. So just know that you need to have this in your scenes. You need to show consequences for your character's decisions. The next thing that's important to know is that your scenes need to show a scene and sequel. Okay, so your scenes are either going to be action scenes or they're going to be reflection scenes. The action scenes are typically what we think of as a scene. Things are happening. The reflection scene is the sequel scene. And so let me tell you, let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So in the first one, the action scene, this is the one, again, that we typically think of. So things are happening, there's actions, there's fights, there's car chases, there's all kinds of things that happen during these scenes. And they typically involve action, what we were talking about, movement, all of that. So sometimes writers conclude that this must be in every single scene, and that would be totally exhausting for readers. So we can't have those type of scenes all the time. We need to have little breaks in between. But the action scene has this structure. First of all, it has a goal. So the character has a goal that he wants to achieve within that scene. So let's say there's a guy, Bob, he wants to make his wife happy. So he decides to make her dinner. Okay, so he has a goal, wants to make his wife happy. So his action, he's going to make her dinner. And we know that we must have some conflict, right? So we have the scene started. There's the goal. He's making dinner. What is the conflict? Well, maybe the doorbell rings and Bob opens the door and there's a guy standing there. He says he is his wife's ex-husband, an ex-husband that he didn't know she had. So some conflict. Then Bob's wife comes home and finds these two guys standing in her living room talking. So what follows the goal and the conflict is a disaster. Okay, so something bad has to happen here. And usually what happens is the situation just gets worse. So not only is he an ex-husband that Bob didn't know about, but he also, there's something else that's worse than that. And so he might say, okay, the reason I'm here is because I've been accused of bank robbery and I need a place to hide out. And so I thought of you, ex-wife, and I'm here to hopefully stay at your place for a while. So now Bob's thinking, well, wait a minute. I didn't even know this guy existed. Now he wants to stay in my house where my wife lives, right? So things have gotten worse. Not only is he dealing with an ex-husband, but now he's dealing with an ex-husband wanting to live with him, right? And he's been accused of a bank robbery or whatever. So things have gotten worse. It's become a bigger disaster. But of course, not every scene has to be this major dramatic thing. It could have been just a little simpler, right? It could have been that, okay, he decided that he's going to make this dinner for his wife, but he doesn't really know how to cook very well. And so he burns everything, and the conflict is the wife comes home and the living room house is filled with smoke and he's trying to put it all out. And so instead of having a nice romantic dinner, it becomes worse as a disaster. She gets angry and she leaves, or she goes and slams the door and goes to her bedroom or whatever, right? So it's not as big as the first disaster, but it's still a disaster, and it still follows that goal, conflict, and disaster format. So what's happened here is the scene started kind of in the positive, right? He had a positive goal, even though they weren't getting along or whatever. But it started positive and it ended negative. So there's been a change within that scene. Now, the second type of scene, the sequel, is a little different. And typically what it is a reaction to the scene that came before. So we had that action scene. Now we're going to have a reaction to that scene. And how does that work? That also has a structure. Okay, so the very first thing is there is some type of emotion. So Bob's going to have some type of emotion to this guy just showing up at the house, right? So it could be anger, it could be hurt, it could be confusion, it could be anything that Bob might be feeling when he opens the door and the guy's like, "Hi, I was married to your wife before." Okay, and the next thing after the emotion, after that shock or whatever he's feeling, is going to be a thought, of course. He's going to think something, right? So as he's standing there and this guy's saying, "Hey, I'm the ex-husband and I also want to stay here because I'm in trouble with the law," Bob's going to have a thought like, "What now? I hope my wife says no, but what will I do if she says yes?" Right? So he's going to have a thought. He's going to have a thought that's going to go along with that emotion that he just had. Following that is a decision. So he had an emotion. He had a thought about like, wow, what am I going to do now? And now he's going to make a decision. And so maybe he might decide, you know what? I have this boat. I'm just going to let this guy stay in my boathouse for a couple of days until he sorts out whatever is happening to him. And at least I still look like a good guy, but I don't have him in my house with my wife, right? So he makes a decision to help out so that his wife doesn't have to decide like, yes, no, he can stay here, he can't stay here. Bob has decided, right? He's made a decision. And it's good because you actually do want your main character to be making the decisions. And the last thing that happens is an action. So now that he's made a decision, there is going to be an action. So maybe Bob and his wife now stuff this guy, bank robber guy, into the car, hide him, drive him to the marina where the boat is, and maybe they have a feeling like they're being followed or something's happening, but that is the action that they're taking. Okay, so that concludes this reflection scene, this sequel scene that is tied to the previous scene. And often what happens is after a sequel, you have another action type scene. So now if they were being followed, there's going to be some kind of action again where they have a goal of trying to get away from these people that are following them and chasing them or whatever, right? So we have a scene, then we have a sequel, then we have a scene, then we have a sequel. Now, it can be more complicated than that. You can actually have two scenes back to back and then a sequel. You don't have to, it doesn't have to go like that each time. And the flow of your story will let you know, do I need another action scene here? Do I need a follow-up action scene? So sometimes there's going to be more than, one action, one sequel, one action, one sequel. So great. Now let's talk about those transitions, right? So we know there needs to be change in the scenes. We know that there has to be that cause and effect in scenes. We know that there needs to be scenes and sequels so that you're not having all action scenes. So now how do we connect these? You can probably tell that the scene and sequel actually connects pretty well, because if we follow up an action scene with a sequel scene, it flows very well because that sequel is going to be based on exactly what happened prior, right? The previous action scene, then that reaction scene comes right after that. So let's talk about that opening of a scene and that closing of a scene, because that's where our transitions are going to be. And specifically then, how do we do that? How do we move from one scene to the next scene? One way is to use dialogue. So especially for sequel scenes, sometimes it helps to have the next scene start with dialogue, with the character reacting to what just happened, because it draws the reader into the story to see what these people are going to say based on what just happened. So for example, Bob and his wife in that sequel scene could be having an argument saying, well, what are we going to do? And what do you mean taking him to the boathouse? And how are we going to get him there? And then who is this guy, right? So that argument is interesting to the reader because the reader wants to know now what these characters are thinking. And so if they're having a discussion, they're having a dialogue, we can listen to this, right? We can get into their heads and see what's going on and what they're saying. Okay, another way is just a narrative. You can have just narrative with like being in Bob's head and thinking and reading about what he's thinking. So a narrative can also be that with his thoughts, what he's thinking, what he's feeling, things like that. So we can also use narrative. And we might start with narrative and then jump right into dialogue. Transitions can also include movement. It can just be a cut to the decision that was made. We're going to take this guy, put him in a boathouse somewhere, and then the next scene can open with them driving to the marina. So there can be movement to the new place. That's another really great transition because it immediately takes us to the new place, the new location. There could be a description of setting. There could be a description of the sun setting. Maybe they wait until night and then all of a sudden now it's darker outside. So anything like that where you're showing movement, where you're showing that that time is changing, that time has passed, that would be a good transition to the next scene. What we want to do is make sure that that opening scene is hooking the reader and pulling them into that next scene. And as far as closing the scene, it's always nice to close with some kind of hook as well, because we don't want to wrap everything up and then have them just, the person close the book. Same thing as at the end of a chapter. We want something interesting that is going to the reader's going to want to keep reading. They don't want to stop at the end of that scene or the end of that chapter. They want to keep reading. And the way you do that is you can have just reveal something new that they don't expect, have some kind of secret or have some kind of surprise. So a great scene ender, for example, would have been as that he opens up the door and he finds out that the ex-husband is there. We close that scene because it's a surprise. It's it's unexpected. When we open the next scene with him, coming into the house, standing there having a discussion, and the wife entering. All right, so those would have been two action type scenes back to back before we get to a sequel scene, or we could have had a sequel scene in between. I probably wouldn't do that because it makes more sense to let the guy come in and then have that discussion of like, who are you? What do you want? So some kind of secret, something new, some kind of surprise is always kind of nice at the end of a scene. Another way sometimes to end a scene is more gentle. Maybe there's a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come. By something that someone says or something that happens that isn't really wild, or something that is not too dramatic, but it just gives us a hint of something that's to come. Okay, so for example, in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Elizabeth overhears Mr. Darcy talking to someone and kind of dismissing her, saying that she's tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me. So it's sort of a little subtle foreshadowing to what's to come, because of course she is going to be tempting enough for him. So that gives us a little clue of what's to come in the relationship between them. So the thing to remember here is that transitions are important because they help to guide the reader right from one scene to the next. And then if you can do it in this very smooth way, it's going to make it more like the reader is really not even going to notice that you've transitioned from one scene to the next, because it's been done smoothly, because they've enjoyed it, because they're eager to find out what's going to happen next. And also something to remember is kind of what I just mentioned a little bit ago, is that not every scene has to like flow into the next very gently. Sometimes it can be an abrupt change. So moving from one location to the next can be an abrupt change, and the reader is perfectly happy to have that, to read that. So it can be at the end of a chapter and the beginning of a next chapter. So you're going from the end of one chapter scene to the beginning of another chapter scene. And sometimes that's great because it's a perfect place for an abrupt change to happen. So an abrupt change like that can create interest, it can create emotion, it can create suspense and surprise. So they don't always have to like gently flow one to the next. Sometimes they will, because especially if you're writing a scene in sequel, it's going to flow very nicely from the previous scene because the reaction is coming after that. But sometimes you want like two action scenes, one after another, and you can have that complete break, and it works really well. The key to writing a good transition is to keep it interesting for the reader. Keep it interesting from one scene to the next so that they want to continue reading. As long as the reader doesn't get lost and you're keeping their interest, then your transitions are working great. The primary requirement of your transitions is that you hook the reader with those openings and closings and keep them reading your story. I hope that this has helped and that you've enjoyed this video. And if you have, please hit the like and the subscribe button and join me again next Friday for my next video. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.